Hi everybody, welcome to our seminar. This is a City ESS ERIC NatCen webinar. I'm delighted to welcome Alex Cernat from the University of Manchester, who's going to be talking to us about transitions to multimode data collection, understanding the measurement dimension. Alex is probably going to talk for around 40 to 45 minutes. If you've got questions for Alex, you can post them in the Q&A chat down at the bottom there, and we will take questions at the end of the talk. So I'm going to hand over to Alex.
Hello, everyone. Really good to see you kind of virtually here. I just went through participant lists and I see lots of familiar names, and I fondly remember the days when we used to see each other at conferences face to face. So I appreciate you're here and not watching cat videos or doing other more entertaining things. So I'm probably not going to be as entertaining as that, but I hope to be just slightly more informative compared to cat video online. So let me share my screen and we can get started. Okay, so before we start, a few admin things. So first, I just want to give a big thanks to my collaborators here, just in alphabetical order. So today I'm just going to go through a few papers and some research I'm doing with different people around the world. And I just want to thank them. I take full responsibility for anything silly I'm going to say today. Otherwise, the work, like I said, is joint work with all of these great people. So what are modes and why are we here? So modes and modes of interview are ways in which we collect data. And there are kind of four general types of modes. So we have traditional face-to-face interviews, which can be paper or computer assisted. We have some kind of telephone interviews, which again can be computer assisted, where somebody calls and asks questions by telephone. We have web surveys, and then we have mail surveys. So these are kind of the general modes of interview, and there are different versions of this. So for example, like I said, face-to-face could be paper or computer assisted. Web mails could be done on a mobile device, like we see in the picture bottom left, or they could be done on a computer. So there are different kind of flavors of modes of interview. So why do we care about this? Well, there are some traditions about how to collect data. So for example, in UK, face-to-face was popular. Telephone was also popular for short and fast surveys. In other countries, like in the US, for example, telephone was very popular until recently. And in other countries, there would be a mixed mail or some other mode. But trends in recent years have meant that we're moving away from the traditional modes of interview we've been using and switching to either a different mode or a combination of modes. And there are a couple of reasons why we're doing this. So one is related to cost. So in order to do face-to-face interview, it's more expensive these days, and to have high quality face-to-face, low non-response, then the costs are much higher than they used to be. Another issue is timeliness. Now there's an expectation to have data faster and be available for analysis. And traditional modes like mail or face-to-face sometimes are considered too slow. Of course, there's the pandemic, which has really encouraged the shift even further. In some places being impossible to use a traditional mode like face-to-face, and basically making research agencies have to switch to something else, telephone or web. Other issues are response rates. So response rate have been going down considerably in the last decades, and there's a hope that if we use other modes or a combination of modes, we can deal with this issue in a cost-effective way. And then there's also bias. So the risk is that if we just use a particular mode, let's say just telephone, then we might get particular types of respondents, and we're missing other types of respondents that, for example, don't have landline or have strange working hours and don't answer face-to-face surveys or live in a particular type of building where interviewers don't have access and so on. So because of all of these pressures, there's a shift away from single mode. In UK, traditionally, maybe that would be face-to-face. In other countries, maybe it would be telephone, to something else, be it a combination of modes or being just a different mode altogether. So what's the issue? So you could say, okay, we're using different modes to do interviews. So what's the problem? Why should we care about this thing? Well, the issue is that different modes have different characteristics, or they encourage different types of measurement error. None of the modes of interviews are perfect. So even the traditional ones, let's say telephone or face-to-face, would have some type of measurement error. But the issue is that as we switch to a different mode or multiple modes, they have different types of measurement errors. So then we have issues whenever we want to do some comparisons in time, for example. So what kind of characteristics of, or what type of measurement error do different modes have? Well, from my reading of the literature, there are kind of two big dimensions here. One is an interview present or not in the mode? So we can put in one category face-to-face and telephone modes, and we can put in a separate category mail or web modes. And then if we have an interviewer, then this can impact basically a couple of things. The most obvious and the thing that was consistently found in the literature is social desirability. So there's a tendency for people to be more honest when an interview is not present. So in web and mail surveys or in any kind of self-completion mode, people tend to be more honest and have less social desirability. So you might tend to see more activities that are considered sensitive, such as drinking and drug use and so on. Another thing that is found sometimes, although not consistently, is acquiescence. So there's a slightly higher tendency to have acquiescence, or the tendency to agree with a statement regardless of its content when we have interviewer modes. And again, this might be due to the respondents trying to kind of agree or have a rapport with the interviewer. Another important dimension here in comparing modes is the mode visual or oral mainly. So visual modes would be something like mail or web. Oral modes would typically be face-to-face or telephone. Again, there can be combinations of these. So for example, the European Social Survey would use an interviewer, but also have show cards for many of their questions, in which case you have a combination of visual and audio input. And here, there's some research showing that we have primacy and recency effects. So primacy effect happens more in visual modes, with the tendency of respondents selecting the first categories, especially when you have a longer list, while recency tends to happen in oral modes like telephone, because people tend to remember more the last categories that were presented to them. Other issues are around non-differentiation. So there are different patterns of non-differentiation for visual and oral modes. So the conclusion of this is that we have a pressure to move away from traditional modes, be it telephone or face-to-face, and different modes have different characteristics of their measurement. So they have different types of measurement error. So we want to understand what are these effects of the modes in order to know if we have issues when we do, for example, comparisons in time, or when we have multi-mode data collection with some people answering in one mode and some people answering in another mode. And the big challenge here, and this is a big part of what people have to do when they do research on mixed modes or on mode and measurement, is the confounding of selection and measurement. So typically there's a self-selection in one of the modes. So some people might select one mode over another, and then each mode has different characteristics of its measurement. So then we have this confounding of the two. So if you really want to understand what's the effect of the mode, somehow you have to deal with this confounding and try to separate them, because only then you can understand what's the true effect and what are the things that you should be concerned about. So a big part of the literature is really dealing with this confounding and selection of and measurement. So in order to do that, ideally, we would have some kind of experimental design, and also we would have some kind of correction for whatever selection is left, even if we have an experimental design. Okay. So today or tonight, what I want to do is to answer these two research questions. So I want to see, do we get the same data quality in different modes? And I'm mainly going to concentrate on modes of interview and data quality as seen in the measurement data quality. And so I won't talk about selection or modes of invitation in a survey. I'll talk about mode of participating in a survey and data quality relating to measurement. So that's one part of the things that I want to discuss. And the second one is I want to see if the change of modes impact estimates. And especially I'm interested in estimates of change. So studies like the European Social Survey, and other repeated cross-sectional surveys like European Value Study are switching modes or are considering to switch modes. And then they might have issues if they want to look at aggregates, trends, or changes in time. So what happens if I used to have for 8 waves a face-to-face survey and then I switch to web? Can I still look at changes in time, even if I look at aggregates at the country level? So I think that's a really important aspect. And this is even more important for longitudinal studies like Understand Society, cohort studies, ELSA, and so on. All of these studies, if they switch modes during data collection, which many of them have to do or have done, then will this impact estimates of change? And again, we're collecting these large, expensive longitudinal studies, typically because we want to look at how change happens. So it's quite important to understand if the change of mode actually can change can bias estimates of change. So these will be the two things I want to look at. And the way I'll do it is I'll go through 4 studies that are in different stages of review. One is published and others are under review. And I'm going to share with you what I have learned or we have learned and kind of give you some insights about upcoming research that hopefully will be published soon. So in the next few slides, I'm going to argue, and here I'm giving you the conclusion. So if you thought you had enough and you just want to know the conclusion, this is the conclusion. So I think overall, the studies I'm going to present, we have encouraging evidence that there are relatively small differences in measurement between modes. And also, it seems that estimates of change can be similarly calculated or found in face-to-face and web or in a single mode and mixed mode design. So overall, I think I'm going to present a relatively optimistic picture of what's happening with our switch to multiple modes of data collection. Okay, so let's start with study number 1. So here we're going to look at the European Social Survey, and we're going to look at an experiment where we compare web data collection and face-to-face data collection. And this paper has already been cited, published, you can see on the slides here. Okay, so the data we're going to use is the European Social Survey Wave 8. So in Wave 8, they had the interesting design where there was a follow-up study in 3 countries, Estonia, Slovenia, and UK, where respondents to the SS were invited to be part of an online study and were followed up, I think, if I remember correctly, monthly with short surveys online. The study is called Chronos. You can see more about it on the website. And it's a very nice design. So what we did is we used this design where we basically have the same respondents answering once in web and once in face-to-face. and we compare their tendency to have different types of measurement error. And here we show you the numbers. So for example, we use the ESS and wave 5 and 6 of Chronos. So in Estonia, we had around 600 people that answered both ESS and wave 5 of Chronos, and around 600 that did wave 6 and ESS. We had around, in general, around 600 in each country that participated both in face-to-face and then a few months later in web. And we use this design where we have the within and within design same people answering in different modes for the questions that were measured in both. So we have a set of questions that were measured both in face-to-face and web. We look at a couple of different ways to estimate data quality. So we look at non-response proportions for 26 questions. We look at non-differentiation. That's for 4 multi-item scales. We look at primacy and recency proportions for 5 multi-item scales. And then we look at equivalence testing for 5 multi-item scales. And I'm going to explain what equivalence testing is now. So what you see here, this beautiful abstract picture is a model in structure cohesion modeling or factor analysis, where each square represents an observed question in a survey. It could be attitudes toward politics, for example. And the large circles are a factor or random effect. So here, basically, we have 2 factor models, and we have the same concept measured twice, once in DSS and once in Chronos. In this case, we have something related to politics. So we have the same 4 questions, even if they have different names there, they're the same questions measured face-to-face and web. And what we want to do is to compare the structure of this factor model in face-to-face and web. And we'll see this quite a lot in the next study, so I thought I should explain it here. And typically there are kind of 2 types of coefficients that we care a lot about. So one are the loadings, or these relationships between the big circle and the squares, which are represented by lambdas. And these, you can see them as proxy for data quality. So the larger these are, then the stronger the relationship between the factor and the observed scores. And then the other thing we care about are these tau's coefficients or intercepts. So those are the expected values of the variables conditional on the factor. And what we want to test is if the coefficients are the same across groups. We have an implicit assumption that they would be the same. And if they are, then we have the same measurement quality across modes. If we don't, then we have different relationships, and these factors or these concepts cannot be compared across groups. Here we also, you see these double arrows at the bottom. We also take into account the fact that we have a within experimental design. So we also include correlations between the residuals. So you'll see this quite a lot in the studies. We have basically 3 levels of equivalence. So we have the configurable model or equivalence, where we say we have the same structure. So 4 observed scores, observed variables, and 1 latent variable, for example. But we don't have any restrictions about equality of coefficients. Then we have a more stricter model where we're saying all the loadings should be equal between the groups. So that means that the same kind of estimate of data quality is the same across groups. And if this is true, then we can compare variances or other unstandardized coefficients between groups. And the most strict type of equivalence we're going to look at is called scalar equivalence. And this means that both the loadings and the intercepts are equal. So it means that both these loadings that refer to variance and the intercepts that refer to means are the same across groups. And that means that the concept of interest can be compared. So that would mean that I can compare political ability or political interest in web and face-to-face, and I could actually make a comparison that makes sense because the 2 concepts are measured in the same way. Okay, so the scales that we analyze in this ESS study are political ability with 4 questions, political participation, 6 questions, social trust, 3 questions, social benefits, 4 questions, and trust in institutions, 6 questions. So all of these are very popular scales. They're used in many studies. So I think they give us a good sample of questions to test. So some high-level results. So 5 out of the 6 comparisons that we looked at show that we have more missing data in the web survey compared to the face-to-face survey. And the web survey, although the overall levels of missing data is relatively low, still the difference is significant, and we have more missing data in web surveys. Then for non-differentiation, or this is how different are the responses for the scales, we don't see any differences between the 2 modes, face-to-face and web. And for primacy and recency, we see more primacy in Chronos. So this is in line with what we're expecting, with visual modes showing more primacy compared to face-to-face. If we look at equivalence, so testing if this measure model is the same across groups, we see that we find metric equivalence in all the comparisons, so for all the scales, which I think is a very good result. And we also find, but we find scalar equivalence only for some of the questions. So we do find some differences in the averages of the questions, even after we control for the factor. So overall, I would say this is kind of a positive finding. We do find that we have metric equivalence. Some scales have scalar equivalence as well, but there are still some questions that would be different. So these are the conclusions. So like I said, overall, I think this is a good sign from DSS. We seem to have similar answers both in web and face-to-face. Okay, study number 2. So here we have the European Value Study in Germany. And here we compare web and face-to-face. And again, we have an experimental design. So the data is European Value Study 2017-18 from Germany. And we have 3 groups. So we have a single mode face-to-face group. And then we have 2 mixed mode groups that are sequential, web, and mail. And actually, we have 2 versions of this. We have a long version, which is exactly the same survey as the face-to-face one, but either in web or mail. And then we also, there's a version where there's a shorter version of the survey. So they did basically randomly allocating people different groups of question. So instead of the usual length, which is around 60 minutes for the first face-to-face survey, they would get around 35, 40 minutes in the short version of it. And different people got randomly different questions from the survey. So these 3 groups are randomized. So people were randomly allocated to one of these 3 groups. So we have a nice experimental design. And in addition to this, we also use weights based on admin data to control for any other selection we might have into the groups. So here we looked at a lot of questions. So we looked at 132 questions split over 23 scales. And we looked at a couple of different data quality indicators, missing data, straight lining, extreme response, mid-response, and equivalence testing. And we did 2 types of comparisons. So we did face-to-face versus the mixed mode long. And then we did another comparison, which is mixed mode long versus mixed mode short. And the reason why this is interesting is that we know that it's not a good idea to have a 1-hour online survey. So we need to think of strategies in which we can make surveys shorter in order to offer them by mail or online. So here it's nice that we are comparing both modes and also a strategy of making surveys shorter so we can know if length is problematic or not. So here we have some distributions. So top row, for example, we have just the averages for all the questions we looked at. Like I said, 142. And on the left, we have the means of the question in face-to-face. And on the bottom, we have the means in the mixed mode long design. And the empty circles, those are questions that are not statistically significantly different between groups. So we see most of them are like that. And then there are a few that are black inside as well. So those are statistically significant. So we see there are some questions that have different averages across groups, but overall, we see that many of them have the same average, both in face-to-face and in the mixed mode long design. On the right side, we compare the mixed mode matrix, which is this shorter version of the mixed mode data collection with the mixed mode long. And here we see even fewer differences in the average. So most of the questions have the same average in these two designs. Then we do the same for standard deviation, where there's less variation. And again, we see some differences when we compare single and mixed mode designs, and fewer differences when we compare short and long. And then at the bottom, we have a distribution of the differences between these. And again, we see that they're centered around 0. There's no kind of systematic bias in one direction or another. And most of them are not very different between the two modes. We look at a couple of other quality indicators. So these, we made indicators and we averaged them over all the questions. So for example, the number of no answers, we see that the mixed mode design has significantly more of those compared to face-to-face, although there's no difference between the short and the long version of the mixed mode. This is also true for the don't know answers, although here the long version of the mixed mode is significantly different from the short mixed mode design. If we look at the number of extreme responses in all the questions we had, we see there's no significant difference between the three designs. For middle response answers, we see there's a difference just between face-to-face and mixed mode long, with more middle answers for the mixed mode long. And we see a similar pattern for straight lining. Okay, so part of this supports what we saw before, that maybe self-completion has more non-response compared to an interviewer mode, but otherwise we see that they're relatively similar. Okay. So we looked at 23 different scales, and out of these 23, 20 of them we found metric equivalent. So just a reminder, that means that the relationship between the factor and the observed scores are the same. So we can think of kind of reliability or data quality seems to be similar between the two groups. And if we have metric equivalence, we can compare unstandardized coefficients across modes without any bias. Free scales did not even meet this level of equivalence. So some questions about norms, about watching things related to politics, and about traditional family values. If we look at scalar equivalence, so that meaning also the conditional means are the same across groups, 15 out of 23 of the scales also have scalar equivalence. Again, I would say this is quite good news for us. So it means that a big proportion of what we want to measure in the surveys can be measured the same way in a single and a mixed mode design, or in a interviewer mode and self-completion modes. If we compare length, we see that we have similar patterns, although fewer differences. So only 2 scales did not have metric equivalence when compared the short and the long version of the single mode of the mixed mode survey. So that's the questions about policies and about traditional family values. And 19 out of the 23 scales had scalar equivalence. So there were 4 of them that did not have scalar equivalence between the short and the long questions. So conclusions from this study. So overall, we see small differences across modes and mode designs. when we look at means and standard deviations, most scales have metric equivalence across groups, and around 2/3 have scalar equivalence. And looking at design decisions, it seems that the mode is more important or something to consider more than the length. It seems that having a shorter survey using a random design where people get fewer questions in a self-completion design seems to work relatively well and is less problematic than the differences between face-to-face and self-completion. Okay, study number 3. Here we look at the next steps cohort study, and here we make a comparison between web, telephone, and face-to-face. So this was not an experiment. So here we have to deal with the issue of selection explicitly. So we look at wave 8 of the UK next steps cohort study. This is where respondents had 25 years. And here the people from the cohort studies used the sequential mixed mode design with people first invited to web. If they didn't participate by web, they would be invited to telephone and then to face-to-face. So here actually we use quite a complex model to deal with selection, where we use many variables from the previous waves to develop a robust model for selection. And then we do the kind of comparisons of data quality using equivalence testing after controlling for selection. That being said, keep in mind, this is not an experiment, and kind of the differences we find are conditional on this model we created to deal with the selection into modes. So we look here at a couple of scales. So adult, GSQ, 2 scales measuring leisure, locus of control, bullying, and alcohol use. And here you see the number of items for each one and the number of response points. So just a reminder, what we do here is basically we have 3 groups. So we have a concept measure by web, by telephone, and by face-to-face. And then we compare the loadings and the intercept and see if they're the same. So over all the scales we look at and over the 3 modes, we found that all of them are scalar equivalent except leisure A and leisure B. And here we have particular questions that are significantly different across modes. So again, I would say this is a very positive finding. So the questions that were different were these ones. So here you see the distributions based on our model for different answer categories for different types of activities. So for example, looking at how many times they go to the cinema, concerts, theater, and other live performance. Oh, this is a very interesting question. I forgot people used to do this. Anyway, so we see that for most categories, the distribution is the same. The only difference is for the web respondents, and they tend to answer less never, and they tend to answer more less often. Yeah, so they are more willing to say that, or they choose the middle category for that. We see a similar pattern for leisure activity groups, while for others like going to a pub or club, we see that web respondents tend to say less that they go once a week, and they say more that they go once a month. And this is similar for sports and exercising, and kind of similar for unpaid work and voluntary work. So some of these patterns are in line with social desirability. So the fact that they're willing to say that they don't go to the pub or exercise so often might be an indication that maybe they're more honest when they answer by web compared to the 2 interviewer modes. For the others, the first 2 patterns, again, it's not really clear. It might be some kind of recency primacy thing going on. So conclusions from the study. So overall, it seems that the modes measure these key concepts in the same way in web, face-to-face, and telephone. There are some few differences in the web responses, and some of them at least are in line with lower social desirability compared to the other modes. Okay, study number 4, almost done, almost at end. So here we look at Understand Society Innovation Panel, and here we have an experiment. So we have data collection, which is on the one hand, we have a group that is just face-to-face, single mode, and then we have a sequential mixed mode with web and face-to-face. So around 1/3 is in the single mode face-to-face, and around 2/3 are in the sequential web face-to-face. And here we look at actually multiple waves. So we look at waves 5 to 10, where people were allocated consistently in these two groups overall. And we make two types of comparisons. So first we compare single mode and mixed mode, which in principle is a random allocation. So selection should be less problematic. And also we make a comparison between face-to-face versus web. And so here we take the face-to-face answers from the mixed mode design and put them together with the single mode. And here we use weights and try to deal with the selection issue, the fact that people in the mixed mode can auto select in one of the modes. So this is just to give you an idea about the patterns of changing modes. So this is just for the people that are in the mixed mode design. So we see that many of them do web around in the first, in wave 5, around half of them do web, half do face-to-face. And then there are different patterns of switching. So switching both from face-to-face and web and the other way around, and also to different types of non-response. And given all this switching of modes, I think a really interesting and important question is, well, can we get the same estimates of change between these two groups, between single mode and mixed mode, or between web and face-to-face? And this is really, I think, an essential question as more longitudinal studies are moving to mixed mode designs. So this is what we try to tackle in this study. So we use this 6 waves of data between waves 5 and 10, and we did models for estimation of change and comparing them across groups. So initially we started with all the variables that were measured in any of the waves from 5 to 10. So that was something like 2000. And then we used different criteria. So for example, they had to be measured at least in 3 waves, and they had to have enough cases that participated. In the end, we had 41 questions that we used for our analysis. And we did, like I said before, 2 comparisons, single mode versus mixed mode, which was experimental, and face-to-face versus web, where we use weights to deal with selection. And we looked at 3 types of coefficients: the average change, so the average change overall, then the variance of change, or the between variation in change, and then the correlation between change and the intercept. And the reason why we looked at this is because these are the typical coefficients that are estimated in models such as latent growth modeling and multi-level model for change. So here I present like a figure for a latent growth model. So imagine here we have 4 observations of the same variable, and we have these 2 random variables, these factors. The one on the right represents change, so the average change in time. So alpha is the average change, and next to it is the between variation, or how people are different in their change. And then on the left side, we have the intercept, or the average and between variation at the start of the study, and then we have a correlation between them. And really the key coefficients, the reason why we pay millions of pounds for longitudinal studies, is for these coefficients on the right: average change and between variance in change. Yeah, so this is really the key statistic that we want with longitudinal data. And then as a side note, also we have this correlation between the intercept and the slope. And that tells us if people converge or diverge as time passes. So it's also an interesting coefficient. So what we do is we run this model separately for the 2 groups, single mode or mixed mode, or face-to-face or web. And then we restrain different coefficients, and then we see if the model gets worse or not. Similar a little bit with what we do with equivalence. And then we get a conclusion out of that. We do it separately for all 41 questions. So this is the distribution of the BIC. So BIC is a fit index. It tells us how good the model is. And this is actually the difference between models. So if if the BIC difference gets very large, it means that if we restrict the coefficient to be the same across groups, then we make a bad assumption. So the first thing we restrict is the mean of change, that's on the left side, then the variance of change, the middle, and then the correlation between intercept and slope. And I use the cutoff point of 10 for the BIC. So if it's below that, it means we're fine. So it means that the estimate of change is the same between the two groups. If it's above 10, then it's problematic. So what we found is that for calculating average change in time and the between variation in change between the two types of comparison we didn't find any significance difference. So that's, again, excellent news because it means we can estimate change in the same way in the two designs. On the other hand, when we looked at correlation, which is this coefficient that tells us how much people converge or become different as time passes, we see quite a lot of more differences. So conclusions here. So overall, we see that we can compare basically the change in the two different modes. And again, this is really very good news, given that a lot of longitudinal studies are switching to mixed mode designs. We did find that a number of variables had differences in this correlation between the intercept and slope, and it's still not clear why that is the case. Okay, so some concluding remarks. Well, overall, I hope I convinced you that we have relatively encouraging evidence from 4 studies, 2 repeated cross-sectional studies, 2 longitudinal studies, that there are relatively small differences between different modes, so face-to-face, telephone, and web, and the measurement seems to be similar between them. There's still some differences, but overall, I would say it's quite encouraging. Especially, I think the last study is quite encouraging because studies like Understand Society moved to mixed mode already. And the fact that we show here that we can estimate change in the same way in a single mode and a mixed mode design, I think will be something that they'll be happy to hear. So before I finish, I just want to actually do a little plug. So tomorrow, our new book will be launched at Oxford University Press, where actually there are a few studies that look at this. So at least 2 of the chapters in the book look at mixed modes and longitudinal studies and impact on change. So please have a look at that. And also we're organizing a masterclass, a half-day event where we talk about measurement error and longitudinal data. So that's together with Royal Statistical Society. So if you have time, please go on the links that you see here, and yeah, I hope you find something interesting there. Otherwise, that's it, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Alex. I can see some questions that are being posted in the Q&A. Do folks use the Q&A to post your questions to Alex? I'm going to walk through some of the questions that are already there for you, Alex. So there's a first question which related to, I think, the first of the experiments that you talked about on the ESS. And the question was, how can you be sure that the face-to-face and web respondents are the same person when you're making the comparisons between the ESS and then the Chronos?
Yeah, so they have the same ID. So it's basically, this is a within, it's basically like a longitudinal study in which the first wave was ESS, and then there were multiple repeated measures using web data collection. So we just have a unique ID for all individuals, and we can see the people that participated at different stages. So it's a very nice within experimental design.
Great, thank you. And now a question from John Dillman. So again, relating to the first study, did the show cards for the interviewers show the visual display of the opinion question scale?
Yeah, so the ESS does use show cards. I think I should I should ask Rory this, but yeah, I think I'm not sure if the presentation is exactly like in the web design. I do think the fact that they use show cards probably helped decrease the amount of differences you see between web and face-to-face. But there's no experiment around that. But typically ESS does use show cards. the design is probably slightly different to what they would see online, but it still probably minimize some of the differences across modes.
Okay. And there was also a question about, was the wording exactly the same between the web and the interview versions?
Yeah, if from what I remember, it was the same wording. Again, this is a great study that you can just go on the ESS website and you can see all the questionnaires and all the data, so you can double check that. But I think when we looked, it seems to have the same wording.
Great, thank you. So next question was, I can't remember which presentation this related to, but it was, you showed a graph. I've got a feeling it was the third experiment.
Okay.
You had a graph that showed kind of, it had flows in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one. And the question was, what kind of graph? How did you make that graph? What did you use?
It's in R. It's I forgot something, not squawky. I forgot the name, but yeah, just drop me an email and I can share the syntax. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And a question from Rory. There appear to be some quality differences between long and somewhat shorter questionnaires in the Eves work. Were these large enough to suggest using shorter instruments in future, or is the extra information collected in the longer one justified?
Yeah, so I think this is maybe a bigger question for the EVS team. I would say these are relatively small. So if we look here on the right side, just the distribution. So out of 100 something, I think there are 4 that are significantly different. So I think that's pretty good. This is correcting for multiple testing, but still, I think that's good. And here, if we look at this distribution, the only difference seems to be in the number of don't knows, but again, that's just marginally. And then looking at the scales, again, I would say overall, there's small differences. The other thing that we don't discuss here is, well, you have missing data for some people for some questions. And I think this is a question about, well, are your users okay with that? And maybe it's a trade-off between what's good for the users and what's good for the respondents. I don't think we want to give a 1 hour online surveys to respondents, maybe to do it online or or on a phone. So I think we want for respondents maybe to have shorter surveys, but then our users of the data, maybe they want all the data for everyone. So it might be a trade-off here between what's good for the users and what's good for the respondent. There are ways to deal with this, like doing imputation, the fact that we have it's an experimental design. So in principle, we can impute, for example, the data for those that are missing. It's more are users okay with using imputed data, which I'm not sure if all of them are. So I think it's a trade-off. I'm not sure, what's a good position. And also, if you think even for chronos, you kind of did that as well. You had different waves of chronos which were shorter than ESS, and you gave them just part of the questions. So in a sense, there you also did this trade-off. It wasn't a clear experiment, but also you could do it that way, where you have multiple waves of data collection that are shorter.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thank you. And another question, did you look at possible effects of item non-response on the means differences between the modes?
So I don't remember how these were calculated, but I guess they were calculated only for people that answered. So I guess we basically treated this as 2 independent things. So first we look at if they have missing or not. So this is the first 2. And then we did a comparison, which is just the average between the groups. And this is not a within experimental design, it's a between one. So we have different people in the 2 groups. So we just took everyone that answered in that group and did the average. So yeah, maybe we could have done this this comparison of the mean after we do some correction for item missing. yeah, so maybe that's something we can look at. In principle, we looked at both things, but we did kind of ignore missing when we looked at the distributions.
Okay, great. And is it possible to see the show cards and what the interviewer read? So Don is trying to get a sense of the stimulus given to respondents and see if they were exactly the same or different. So
yeah, so it would be on the ESS website. I don't have them at hand. Maybe Rory has an image at hand he can share. But yeah, I would check there. I think it's a good point. I don't think we put the show cards in the paper in the appendix, but they are available online. So I think the short cards is the same they have used for a long time, and I don't think there were kind of, you know, they're probably different to what people would have seen on the web survey. I would guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, a non-answer there. Yeah.
That's fine. And another question. Could you please elaborate a bit more about the differences of the modes regarding reachability of the respondents and the accessibility of the population? As far as I understood, the results were selective in the sense that you could only compare those who participated. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So, I mean, in different studies, we dealt this in different ways. So in the ESS, we clearly have a selection issue. So we only look at people that are both in face-to-face and web. So the nice thing is we have the same people in the same modes, but it could be kind of a sub-sample in the sense that particular people, those 600, maybe they're very different from the 2000 that would normally participate. In other studies, so in next steps, we actually had like a really big model with hundreds of variables that we used to create this selection model. In this study with the EVS, we just used a few variables from the registry that was available for everyone. So I guess different studies have different levels of issues with selection. We kind of dealt with it in the best way we could. I mean, one thing to say is that the fact that we find kind of similar results in very different studies, different countries, different designs is kind of encouraging, I would say. And maybe this is something that as methodologists, we should do more, just, you know, use multiple questions, multiple studies and see how consistent is the finding. But it's very hard to get rid of this feeling that maybe selection is an issue. I don't know, even when you have experiments, you could still argue, well, at a certain point, maybe they drop off or something else happens that could be related to selection. But the answer is we did the best we could. I would argue different studies probably have different levels of this issue, but we find relatively consistent findings. So maybe that's something to take home.
Okay, great, thank you. And another question. This one's about further studies. What types of indicators, except for data quality, could be considered to reveal mode differences in measurement error?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So I guess we can define data quality in different ways. So this is again something we try to do instead of just looking at one thing. So this is why we, in this study, for example, we have mean, standard deviation, differences. We have non-response, extreme styles, straight lining, and equivalence testing. There are probably other ways to do this. So in some studies, we use this model to estimate reliability using longitudinal data called quasi-simplex. Yeah, I'm not sure what other indicators, but we really try to put all the indicators we could. Another one, I guess, is MTMM. So you could do MTMM experiments and use those to compare quality across modes. So the ESS also has some MTMM data, but I don't. So I think Melanie Revilla, for example, did some research looking at MTMM and comparisons across modes.
Do you just want to say what MTMM stands
yeah,
for?
So yeah, sorry, thanks for that. So it's multi-tray, multi-method. So the idea is you ask the same questions in slightly different ways, and that enables you to estimate reliability and validity. And ESS has been doing this for many years. And yeah, Melanie Revilla has a few papers where she compared data quality using that across modes. Yeah, so we just use whatever we could to the best of our ability. I'm not sure, nothing else comes to mind now. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alex. A question now, did you look at differences between web and paper in study 2?
No, so if I remember study, yeah. So if I remember correctly, we didn't have a lot of mail answers. So that's why we ended up combining them and basically using them together. But I think that's a valid point. And another thing that we totally ignored is answering by mobile versus PC, which again, it's a kind of a level of differences that we might get that we just ignored here. So we didn't look at that. I think it's because of number of cases, basically. Also, one thing to note is that this, for example, using matrix design with having different survey lengths and so on is quite complicated to do by mail. So this is an advantage where having full web design is really useful.
Okay. And did you notice any particular trends in the topics of questions that were most likely to show mode differences across the different surveys?
No, I think one thing we noticed, which study was it? Study number 4, I think. So here we did find, I think there were more differences for ordinal and continuous variables compared to dichotomous ones, for example. And again, this might be because they're just more categories. Here, if we look at the cohort study, only these questions about leisure were different. And again, if you think some of this is social desirability, that kind of maybe makes sense. Although if we look at all the questions, so GHQ, bullying also they're quite sensitive, but we didn't find any differences there. So I can't say there's a clear pattern that I can see, except maybe the number of categories might be important for some of these differences. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And question from Lisa Calderwood. For next steps work, we should note also that although the scales were equivalent, there were differences in the means by mode. So that was a clarification point, I think, rather than a question. Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah. So so Lisa is in this paper where we debated this, and we had a big debate about what does it mean. So basically, what Lisa is mentioning is that even after we do the equivalence testing, we estimate these circles, these factors, and the factors have an average and a variance. And in principle, if you have equivalence, then you can compare the groups. So you have valid comparisons. And what she mentions is that after we did equivalence, even when we found equivalence, there were differences in the averages for these. So for example, for bullying for web and bullying for telephone, in these factors, they were different. And the question is, what does that mean? And the reason why I didn't discuss it is because I don't know what it means, because it can be selection. So it could mean that, well, we had this super complicated model, we tried to deal with selection, but there's still some people that, let's say, have more bullying in web than they have in telephone. The measurement model we know is the same, but the average is different. The other reason, it could be there's some kind of systematic bias that we don't get. So let's say it could be social desirability or something that is affecting all the questions, and then it goes to the average of this factor. And the fact, so we did find some differences in these factors, but it's like I'm not sure what to do with that piece of information. So that's why I didn't mention it, because it could be selection, it could be differences in measurement, but we don't know. The only thing we know is that for most of the scales, the measure model seems to be the same between groups.
Okay, and the final question, would your results imply, and then there's IWER effects to be minimal?
I think interviewer effects, probably, yeah.
Interviewer effects to be minimal in face-to-face surveys.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we didn't really look at interviewer effects. I mean, some of the other work we have done on interviewer effects are, I think there are interviewer effects there. I'm not sure if we would capture them here, in the sense that if it's truly random, it wouldn't maybe it would affect the loadings. I'm not sure. So we actually didn't look at that. I'm not sure if this is direct evidence that there's no interviewer effect or they're small. And that's a good point. We should maybe look at that and see. It's kind of an aspect we ignore so far. But it is an advantage for self-completion mode. So in principle, we don't get interviewer effects. So maybe I should have mentioned that at the introduction. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alex, for a really fascinating presentation covering lots of different experiments. You've clearly been very busy.